So welcome to the Roundtable on Immigration and the 2012 elections. I wanted to, just before we start, say some thank yous, but just right away to Jay McCann, who's lead editor of Politics, Groups, and Identities, one of the co-sponsors, which I'll get to in a minute, and also to Katie, who's wandering around. Actually, she just left. But anyway, she'll be back, and we'll say thank you to her again. But just right away to say thank you to those two for helping to organize this event. This roundtable is the kickoff event of a two-day workshop on the politics of race, ethnicity, and immigration. And immigration is an increasingly salient issue in our politics, in our economy, and in our society. And this roundtable considers the role of immigration as we approach the 2012 elections, which will take place this November. So we are bringing together today nationally recognized experts for a public and nonpartisan discussion of the issues who will be attending to issues of race, ethnicity, and the usual themes of electoral politics and public opinion, as well as the kinds of questions about surveys and polling, and then after that we'll have question and answers. So I'm not going to say more about that now, just let our panelists discuss it. I do want to just say a couple words about the people who and organizations that actually made this panel possible. So I want to particularly thank the Discovery Lecture Series, which sponsors an amazing series of speakers and topics, and we're really pleased that they sponsored this roundtable today. I particularly want to thank Al Rebar, Candace Vibert, and also Cindy Ream. The Center for Research on Diversity and Inclusion is a primary sponsor of this event, and this center explores fundamental questions about diversity and inclusion, what kinds of makes us go beyond diversity to achieve real inclusion across a wide variety of dimensions, and we're very pleased to be sponsoring this event today. And you can send us an email at crdi@purdue.edu or go to the webpage, which is on the CLA webpage, the College of Liberal Arts webpage, to find out more about our center. We've been lucky to have really great partners on and off campus who I just want to mention briefly. The first is the journal that I mentioned, Politics, Groups, and Identities, which is a new journal published by the Western Political Science Association. I also wanted to mention our partner in the Politics, Race, Immigration, and Ethnicity Consortium, which is the reason that we have not only incredibly fabulous panelists, but also quite a distinguished audience, which many of you may not be aware of. We have many immigration experts in the audience as well as on the panel. Our on-campus partners are very important, and we wouldn't have this whole event without them, and that includes the Global Policy Research Institute, or as we like to call it, GIPRI, which is a little bit unfortunate, but we bring people together across disciplines to address in a public forum the most challenging issues and bring scientific and scholarly expertise to bear on important public issues. I also want to thank the Political Science Department and our fabulous head, Rosalie Clausen, who's here, and Pi Sigma Alpha, students in the National Political Science Honor Society, the College of Liberal Arts and Dean Weiser, who is also here, and the Office of the Provost, and I want to particularly thank Beverly Seifer, who's here as well, and there are other important supporters. And with that, I would like to introduce another important person from that part of our university, Dr. Suresh Garimella, who will introduce the panel. But before I hand it over to him, let me just say that Professor Garimella is our Associate Vice President for Engagement. He's the Goodson Distinguished Professor of Mechanical Engineering. And here at Purdue, he's the director of the National Science Foundation's Cooling Technologies Research Center. And he received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. And actually I was looking at his vita and bio to think about introducing him, and I became exhausted both from carrying the heavy, weighty vita and bio over to the table and then trying to page through it. I got carpal tunnel syndrome just paging through his vita. So I'm just going to tell you a couple of highlights. And he's been very influential in national policy discussions, working extensively in Washington and with the Department of State in a variety of capacities, including a stint as a Jefferson Science Fellow, Washington Energy Seminar. But the reason we asked him to come today isn't because of all these other accolades and distinguished professorships and amazing things that he's done, prizes and millions of students and all these other things, hundreds of articles, but because he has been a leader on immigration issues both in the university and the community at large and in the Midwest. He's a member of the Task Force on Immigration and U.S. Economic Competitiveness, A View from the Midwest, and he has been kind enough to share a draft of the report, which is very interesting. It's called U.S. Competitiveness at Risk, and it starts to outline some of the important ramifications of the issue we're talking about today. So I'm going to start, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Garimala and thank him very much for helping us today.
Laurel, I thought you'd never stop. Thank you. And welcome to all of you. I have the distinct pleasure of inviting all of you to enjoy this evening. The one thing I did was responsible for is to arrange the great weather so we could sit outside. We do this all the time throughout the year. So anyone who's not from town, then just know that. I hope your travel over was good to our small town. The PRIEC Roundtable and Workshop. I was given some remarks here, but I must say I'm bowled over by the people that I met at dinner and the students I sat with at dinner as well. So there's so many things to discover about campus and about this side of campus that, well, not this side necessarily, but your side of campus. So I'm particularly pleased to have been included in this. So I think it's my honor to welcome you here. This PRIEC Roundtable is designed to offer new possibilities for exposing the Purdue community, us, to cutting-edge research by a diverse group that Professor McCann will introduce in a little bit. And they bring a lot of expertise in the global policy relevance and essentially ethnicity, race, immigration, politics that are the topics of this roundtable. I lead the Office of Engagement at Purdue, and what that is essentially we try to be a good neighbor to the community and a front door to Purdue. And it's interesting how one defines the community. It could be our West Lafayette, it could be the state, it could be the nation, and it is the globe. So Purdue does actually a fairly good job of doing that. We are very happy to partner with almost anyone who would like to come to Purdue to partner with us for our resources and for theirs. So this kind of a discussion fits very well in our engagement mission. We view our mission as being research and learning and engagement, and I think this fits very well in this. I'm not an expert in immigration. I'm a concerned citizen and an immigrant myself, so I consider myself as having a little skin in the game, but some scars as well. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion. Our moderator this evening, Jay McCann, is a professor of political science and lead editor of a new peer-reviewed journal, Politics, Groups, and Identities. I understand it's causing a lot of buzz, so I wish him well with this. And he conducts research on public opinion, participation, political parties, and representation, both in this country and overseas. And he's currently exploring the incorporation of immigrants into American civic life in a project with our students. Thank you, Jay, for moderating this discussion. And I guess I will just leave it to Jay to lay out what this roundtable is trying to accomplish. It's obviously very timely with the November elections coming up. And with that, I turn this over to Jay and look forward to a great discussion. Thank you all very much and welcome.
Well, thank you, Laurel and Suresh, for kicking this off. This is going to be some weekend here. As was mentioned, we have this event tonight, which I liken to maybe Thanksgiving dinner in our family or something when I was growing up. We're going to get a lot of people. We've got 5 panelists, and we may get 6 opinions. We're expecting lots and lots of engagement, a freewheeling discussion. That's at least what I suggested to the panelists. We're not going to do any PowerPoints or anything like that. We're really here to engage people to people, and it's also we're aiming for some audience participation as well. You'll see in your program that if you want to send us tweets, we are high tech. We've got a laptop here that at the moment has gone a little dormant, but we're going to get that work done. But fortunately, we have a safety valve here. We also are low tech. You have index cards up and down. Okay, so we're kicking this old school too, and so what we're going to what we're going to do is I'm going to ask. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, I don't know what that's about, but we're going to take it as a good sign, okay? I'm going to ask each of the panelists to open up with some remarks on where they see the issue of immigration falling in campaign politics in the here and now, or what the impact of the elections this year might be on future immigration policies. Okay, so they're going to talk for, I don't know, 5 minutes, give or take. I'm not going to be any kind of strict timekeeper here, but we're going to get the ball rolling, okay? And then we'll have a sort of give and take discussion, hopefully integrating the audience as well as we go along. So before I do that, though, I need to introduce the panelists to you, and it really is a privilege to be moderating this event. We have such a distinguished lineup here. On my immediate left is Dion Thomas. She's the president and CEO of the International Center of Indianapolis. Ms. Thomas is truly a citizen of the world. As a youth, she lived in Libya, Germany, France, and the United States. From 1996 to 2003, she served as the vice president for external affairs for Planned Parenthood of Indiana. In this role, she partnered with the Latina Task Force to promote healthcare outreach across our state, and she also led an international initiative to set up a family planning and healthcare program in Guatemala. So I'm just cherry picking. Many more things go into that bio, but she's had a very impressive career. Next is Kartik Ramakrishnan. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Riverside. His academic work focuses on civic participation, immigration policy, and the politics of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the United States. Dr. Ramakrishnan directs it's funny to call him that because it's Kartik all during dinner, okay? Directs the National Asian American Survey, an activity that is that's certainly keeping him particularly busy these days during the campaign season. They're just doing a launch tomorrow. He's leaving for Washington, D.C. to begin a launch of this survey. He is currently writing a book on the rise of state and local legislation, and on the rise of legislation on immigration across the U.S. states over the last 10 years. Next is Lisa Garcia Bedoya, an associate professor of social and cultural studies in the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley, and chair of Berkeley's Center for Latino Policy Research. Lisa publishes widely on the civic engagement of Latinos and other ethnic groups in the United States. Her forthcoming book focuses on the effects of get out the vote drives during campaigns. Okay, a very timely topic indeed. Okay, next is my old friend Niambi Carter, an assistant professor of African American. Yes. What's that? Yeah.
Speak that into being, maybe just on your word.
Yeah. An assistant professor of African American Studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. Okay, Dr. Carter's research expertise focuses on the politics of race and gender in the United States. Niambi is now completing a book on African American public opinion regarding immigration. Recently, she published an article on lynching and sexual violence. Okay, during this academic year, though, she's down in Atlanta, Georgia, Emory University, on a very prestigious fellowship. And then finally is a new colleague that we can welcome to Purdue, Valeria Sinclair Chapman, who conducts research. We just pulled her away from Rochester. Okay, she conducts research on African American and minority politics, political representation in Congress, and redistricting, among other topics. She is the co-author of Countervailing Forces, Exploring the Macro Dynamics of Black Political Participation in the Post-Civil Rights Era, which was published by Cambridge. And it was quite a catch to get her to Purdue. Okay, so let me just, with that, now you know our panelists a little bit, and you're going to get to know them a little bit more through this conversation. Why don't we just go one by one? And I see that Katie, somebody got the computer up and running, so I can resume my moderator's seat here. But we'll just go one by one and let you guys open up with a few remarks.
Start with me?
Starting with Sia.
I have the least academic contribution here. Today I'm actually political junkie and interested very much in the topic that's being discussed this evening. I'm here to bring a local, if you will, statewide perspective on the wonderful and important work that is being done by these individuals, and that really needs to be done. My perspective is as a person that works in international arena, immigrants, recruiting talent from abroad for our major employers, and how we're perceived in Indiana abroad. And my experience at the legislature during some of the immigration debate that was going on. So I think this is a critically important issue that we need to have a very big discussion about in Indiana, and we need to educate our citizenry about this issue. So I look forward to the great minds sitting next to me.
Unless you can speak a little louder, can we have you guys come up to the mic?
Okay.
Because it's hard for, as you each at least make your initial comments, because it's hard for people to hear you.
Actually, yeah, I believe
No, that's,
these are, yeah, for, oh, yeah,
Those
it's
are
like,
not gonna, those are not gonna get you projected.
they're just for appearances.
So I didn't realize we were making prepared remarks, but I just prepared some remarks right now while I was sitting down. Thank you first of all, for all of the organizers here. It's this PGI, this journal is this. It's just like this super committee, and I feel like even this event here, there are just so many people that have pitched in together, and so many institutions that have collaborated on this. It's exciting to be here. I'll just say a few remarks on immigration. This is a topic that within political science, I guess maybe I'll provide a little bit of background. I feel like when I started grad school, there were just so few people studying immigration in the US context from a political perspective. There were plenty of people studying race, and particular racial groups like Asian Americans or Latinos or African Americans, and immigration would come into that mix. But it was rare to find people in political science studying immigration and processes of immigrant adaptation or integration, or however you want to call it. One of the favorite things I used to say when I was starting this work is that sociologists had taken the lead on this, and that political scientists were late to the game, relatively speaking. But that's no longer true. You've had about a decade or more of people that are studying immigration in a comparative perspective, and comparative meaning not just the United States and other countries, but also immigrants of different racial and ethnic groups within the United States. And it's great to see this field. Maybe it hasn't reached maturity yet, but it's in good teenage status, I guess. In terms of what's going on with immigration and immigration politics today, this year I've been trying to finish a manuscript that's been a few years in the making, looking at the rise of immigration policy at the state and local level. And one of the things that's the kind of conclusion that is hard to escape as I've been doing this work is that much of the reason why these laws are being passed is not necessarily to solve actual problems on the ground that are occurring. So there have been some scholars who suggest that it's the different kind of demographic dislocations that occur from immigrants coming to new areas. It's the rise of people speaking Spanish all of a sudden and people not understanding what they're saying, overcrowded housing, fiscal pressures and the like. The research that I've done, I guess would be cast a very skeptical eye to those kinds of explanations. The kind of statistical analysis that I've done over the past few years show that most of those factors don't matter when you look at the larger scheme of things. One factor that does matter is not how, the factors that don't matter are how overcrowded housing is in a locality, how many Spanish speakers there are in those areas, or even how quickly immigration is growing in a region. The factor that consistently matters is how Republican an area is. And this is something that is relatively new in the American kind of political sphere. What you had in 1986 was a Republican president that signed an amnesty that is now widely vilified. It was a Republican president with the assistance of Democrats in Congress, but also Republicans in Congress. What you had in 1986 was a fairly bipartisan piece of legislation that got passed. About 10 years later, in 1996, you also had bipartisan legislation that was more conservative. So you had a Democratic president who signed pieces of legislation on welfare reform and immigration policy that were fairly conservative. And you had Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate that passed it. Right? So when you have bipartisan legislation, it doesn't always mean that it's progressive or that it's immigrant friendly. Go another 10 years to 2006, and what's remarkable there is that the standard kinds of interest coalitions, say between business interests and civil rights groups' interests, that came together in the past no longer seem to hold together. And what you had in the meantime was the rise of partisanship in Congress and in other parts of the country. So you could say that immigration in some, am I talking too long, Jay? You can just yank me whenever you need to. I'll just go on for a couple more minutes, I swear. So it's tempting to say that immigration just fell victim to other dynamics and hyperpartisanship in DC. What I try to show in my book, there is an article-length version of this that I can share. It's on my website if people are interested. Is to show how the conservative activists within the Republican Party on immigration, basically you had a conservative insurrection on immigration well before the Tea Party insurrection in 2009. So the Tea Party did not really gain its major force until George W. Bush had left office and there was a fight for the heart and soul of the Republican Party. Well, on immigration, you had Tom Tancredo doing this in 2000 and 2001 when George W. Bush was pushing for comprehensive immigration reform. One of the things that few people might appreciate is that after No Child Left Behind, Bush wanted to take on comprehensive immigration reform. President Vicente Fox was going to make the first state visit to the United States, and he did. He made that visit in early September, and they were all set to start to pass something like some version of a kind of amnesty or a path to citizenship. But then 9/11 happened, and the policy priorities shifted pretty dramatically. But what's happened in the past decade is that within one party in the United States, you've had a very strong and vocal faction that has grown over time that has been pretty uncompromising on immigration. And this actually hurts the Republican Party, as we saw with John McCain in 2008, and we're seeing with Mitt Romney now. It's hurting him in terms of the Latino votes that he needs in certain key states to be more competitive. And the research that we do on Asian Americans also suggests that some groups that naturally might be constituents within the Republican Party, small business owners and social conservatives and among Asian Americans, are increasingly voting Democrat. One of the maybe least appreciated stories in the last 2 decades is the shift in Asian American voting behavior. So Asian Americans in 1992, only 1/3 of them voted for Bill Clinton. By the time you get to 2008, it's almost 2/3 for Obama. That is a story that's been flying relatively low on the radar screens, but this is a kind of dynamic. The only other dynamic I can think of among immigrants that has happened like this before is with Jewish immigrants between the 1920s and 1940s, where you had a large-scale shift from a pretty diverse party identification pattern to one that was very solidly Democrat. It's starting to happen among Asian Americans, and I think the party image on immigration has significant aspect, has some significant role there. So this is something Republicans need to pay attention to. Finally, I'll just say to maybe be hard on the Democrats too, is that they have the potential of having a group whose votes they take for granted, and every 2 years or 4 years they make promises and never get anything done. But I'll leave that to Lisa to take up. All right, thanks.
So thanks. So I think Karthik's done a nice job of really giving us the background on immigration and policy. I think when we think about immigration and elections, we tend to think about comprehensive immigration reform or what the federal government is doing in terms of immigration policy. I want to talk a little bit about the fact that we don't have an immigrant integration policy in the United States and how that actually affects our elections. And coming from a state like California, where you have literally hundreds of thousands of new voters being brought into the electorate, either folks who've just naturalized or also the children of immigrants who have no parents in their home or other adults in their home who have a voting history or party identification for them to be socialized into. And the way that we deal with it currently in the United States is we just think this will happen in some magical way. And we don't really think about what this means for us as a democratic polity. And so just as an example, this week, the Univision is actually hosting, so right now, I think, a presidential forum with Obama. They had a presidential forum with Romney yesterday. The reason they did those events is because the National Presidential Debate Commission refused to let Jorge Ramos, who's the main anchor of Noticiero 6 o'clock national news on Univision, be a questioner in the official debates. And so the thing to think about is that you have a large sector of the population, many of whom are new voters, who need information on the election. And not everybody who watches Univision is Spanish speakers. Many bilingual Latinos watch Univision because it actually covers things and talks about things and policy questions that aren't covered in the English language media. And you would think that in a liberal democracy, we want our new voters to be as educated as possible. And yet we don't, our Presidential Debate Commission at least doesn't think that perhaps we should think about changing the format so that we reach out to these new individuals who need to be brought into the polity, who are democratic citizens and need to have a voice in our democracy. And so I think when we think about immigration, it shouldn't just be the policies, but we need to think about the fact that we have millions of people in this country. 1 in 5 Americans is either an immigrant or a child of immigrants. And they're here, they're staying. They are part of our country, and we really need to think about how to bring them in to the fabric of American society. And I want to talk just a little bit about that forum. I did watch Romney yesterday on Univision, and people often say that immigration is not the most important issue to Latinos. Consistently, the most important issue to Latinos is education. What is true, though, is that a vast majority, over 80% of Latinos, have been touched by the immigrant experience. In other words, they have a family member, or they themselves are immigrants. And so it's something that's very close to people, it's something that is important to people, and it's something that matters in their day-to-day lives, particularly in places like Arizona, where you have laws that target community members in particular ways because of assumptions about their nativity. And it's understood that for Republicans to win, sort of picking up on Karthik's point, nationally in presidential elections, they're going to need about 38% of the Latino vote. And Romney is in the 30% range. And last night, he was pushed by Jorge Ramos on the fact that he had said in the Republican debates that he believed in self-deportation as a policy toward undocumented immigrants, with no recognition of the fact that those folks that are supposed to kick themselves out because it's essentially making life so difficult for them here that they will decide it's a better decision to go back to their home country, not appreciating that most unauthorized immigrants in the United States have been here for more than 10 years. A vast majority of them have children who are U.S. citizens who were born here. They have wives who were born here. People have lives here. It's complicated, right? There is no simple, gee, let's just get up and go home. There are human ties, and that immigration is a family process. And in this debate, when he was pushed on this question, he basically said that he wasn't planning on deporting 11 million people if he were to become president. But he didn't speak to what it meant for him to sort of say that that's the policy that should be happening, that people should be. He didn't have any good explanation for what we need to do about this very complex issue that is not just black, white, you're either legal or you're illegal. And so I did have a moment, as a Latino watching Univision, of saying, we're not that stupid. You think that you can sort of backpedal around this question, but you're talking about stuff that's really, really important and real to people. And so I think until that rhetoric is able to really think about immigrants as part of American society and move to that next step of integration and what do we think about who we are and what we look like and who we have to think about when we make our policies, we're going to continue to have this very polarized debate across the different policies. So I think it's useful to think about, if we were to have immigrant integration in the United States, can we have a policy of thinking of what that would look like and how do we do that in a way that's humane and consistent with our values as a liberal democracy. Thanks.
Next is Niambi Carter.
All right. So I'm going to thank Karthik and Lisa for their comments because they are actually a nice segue into the way that I'm thinking about immigration at the current moment. And I think we ought to be really careful about the way we think about democracy is always expanding and always opening up. And at least from my vantage point at this particular moment, especially around immigrants, I'm really concerned about the way that democracy seems to be constricting. and in particular with the ways that immigrants are used as convenient scapegoats and smokescreens for a variety of policies that are highly problematic and matter a lot to non-immigrant people as well. And in particular, I'm thinking about voter ID laws. I live in Pennsylvania now, and if you don't know, Pennsylvania is one of those places that has a really harsh voter ID law where you actually need more ID to get a voter ID card than you actually need to get a job. And one thing that I noticed that was really egregious in the state is that poor people, old people, young people, people of color have really been harmed by this new law, in part because we really don't have a language to talk about the fact that a lot of people don't have access to passports or other forms of identification that we often take for granted. Indeed, one of the problematics of this new voter ID law is that you had to have an ID with an expiration date, right? So state issued IDs that didn't have an expiration date would not be admissible to prove that you are a resident or as part of your residency status. And people had to go get voter IDs, state issued IDs. Those aren't free. And I see it a lot in messages where people can just go get an ID. The state is giving those away. The state doesn't give those away. So people who are already resource poor have to take whatever monies they have, and $13 may not seem like a lot to most of us in this room, but $13 can be a lot to somebody who's living on the edge. And to have to go do that just to enforce what is supposed to be your privilege as a citizen, I think gets lost in this debate, because I think most people would feel like, yeah, people who are not citizens, right, who aren't lawfully here shouldn't have the right to vote, and might not find that a problematic proposition. But if we look at the work of McCann and Nishikawa, that's not how these people choose to engage a political system. They're not trying to draw more attention to themselves by being conspicuous and trying to go vote in our elections. And I think if we're not thoughtful about the ways in which we sort of use this sort of illegal immigrant image, which I find highly problematic, highly suspect, racist, and classist, and all that other stuff, gendered, then we miss the ways in which other kinds of people get sort of captured in that net and have their laws taken away. Had their rights taken away. And it's not in the way of you can't vote anymore, but I'm going to make this so torturous for you, right? I'm going to make this so difficult for you. And when you live in a city like Philadelphia, where a lot of people don't have cars, getting on the bus, getting on the train to go to the BMV, and anybody who's ever been to the Department of Motor Vehicles knows that that is a pain any time of day, right? To have to do that and have to go back, right? It's just about wearing you down, right? And making you less likely to participate. So those people who have a lot at stake, and the most at stake in some ways, become beaten down, right? And don't choose to engage the system. And that to me is some of the real dangers of this, and sort of the way that I think about why immigration is so important for all of us, right? Not even those of us who don't have, say, immigrant relatives, but for us as a community of people who are really interested in democracy living up to its full potential. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next is Valeria.
Okay, it is rough to be last in a crowd like this, because there's not much left to say, I don't think. But nevertheless, I shall persevere. Let me just say that recently a political scientist, Bob Putnam, published a book called E Pluribus Unum, right? So out of many one, we understand that. And one of the comments I think that Mitt Romney made recently is that this idea that we are all immigrants. We are an immigrant nation, right? So it sounds really generous and open, and the kind of way that we think, that we like to think of this country used to be a melting pot, then a salad, and I don't know what the new kind of pizza, right? I don't know what the new thing is, marching band, whatever it is. Certainly we have an image of ourselves as really being able to absorb many different kinds of people and traditions and backgrounds as a country. But one of the things that Putnam's work shows is that in this growing diversity, this increasingly diverse country, that diversity is hard, right? It is difficult to find a way to come together. And so what he shows is that in his work, looking at neighborhoods across the country, thousands and thousands of cases, is that in the most diverse neighborhoods that actually people are most isolated, right? That they actually are withdrawn and less trusting, and that it appears that social capital is declining in these spaces. And so what are we to do then? Is diversity bad? Is it intractable? Are we not going to somehow be able to manage going forward with diversity? And so Putnam says no, but that there is a period of time where there is going to be some conflict and some chaos and some turmoil, but that over time it is likely that we find a different path, a different way to construct this new identity that we're creating, a different way to understand this new identity that we're creating. And so then a separate researcher, Scott Page at the University of Michigan, talks about diversity as well. And in his view on diversity, is that diversity actually creates productivity. It's innovative, right? And so when people from different kinds of backgrounds come together, we end up with a better product or outcome at the end. I think that when we consider this question of immigration, that we need to think about looking forward. It matters to all of us, because what matters is what kind of country do we want to be? We are a diverse country. So what kind of country do we actually want to be? And in terms of what my colleagues have said so far, I think that we should not only talk about the policies around immigration, but the politics of immigration. I think that that's really one of the places where Nyambi was going. The way that immigration has become a kind of political football in this country, and the way that it's used, it's reminiscent of the way that the civil rights movement was kind of turned around as a political issue coming out of the 1960s. And so a Southern strategy that would really try to push white Southern Democrats into the Republican Party. And so there's something happening now in terms of the way that we kind of use immigration as a political football. And when we think of the politics of it, it is very much related to voter ID, but also to redistricting, right? To various ways that we will apparently shape the vote. So if we think back to 2008 and how the electorate expanded, more and more young people voted, more and more people of color voted. And so what we see now appears to be a really concentrated effort to just shave off a half a point or 1% of voters. And that can change outcomes in a very close election. And so these things are not unrelated to the 2000 election or the 2008 election. So when we think about immigration, we need to think about how it is used politically in addition to the policies. And I think one last thing that I wanted to say, I think, Karthik, you made me think of the bipartisanship around immigration that we had coming into the 2000s. In the early part of the 21st century, the DREAM Act was introduced as a bipartisan bill in the Senate. And it was just on the cusp of passing in 2010. And that is certainly something, again, as we continue to talk about the politics of immigration, how it shapes voter turnout, who has access to the vote, the right to vote, not a privilege, but the very right to vote. And when we talk about the cost of it, it's not just the cost, right, of going to get the voter ID, it's the cost of proving that you're a citizen. When did that happen? That we, outside of demonstrating that we're residents and the basic kinds of necessity of registering, that now we have to go beyond that to prove citizenship and pay for that, right? The cost of getting to where we need to go. So I think there's so much to talk about, and I look forward to our panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you one and all. Just thanks so much for all of these comments. And it really just goes to show you that the best comments are those that are just not prepared. Okay. These are people who obviously live it, okay, and they're thinking about this 24/7. And so thank you very much for all of these comments. Let me remind you, in your program, you see a Twitter address, and go ahead and tweet us some. I'm not getting any tweets right now, so I take it that we haven't gotten any tweets or tweets, or there's a glitch. But let me also ask our student helpers to circulate and gather up the index cards as well, okay, if any of you have written out on index cards. And while that is happening, we've covered two big kinds of subjects here, okay? We've talked about sort of party politics and the configurations here around issues on immigration, and we've also talked a little bit about policy, okay? So what I think would be kind of interesting to do as a little thought experiment, I want you to imagine that we've had our elections, okay, and the new Congress is taking office, and there's going to be a symposium. You're going to get 10 minutes, okay, with the next Congress and the next president, okay, to talk about immigration and to give your thoughts on the way forward, okay? You have 10 minutes of undivided attention. Okay, this is another one that I didn't forewarn them about, okay? But they're good, okay? So you have 10 minutes of their undivided attention, and as we all know, in politics, that's real time. That's a scarce resource, okay? So I'd like anybody who wants to come up to the microphone to say what would they want to communicate about the way forward? What are the obvious productive steps forward in the next administration?
I'll take the bait. Oh, you?
Okay, just don't fight. No, and then we'll await the index cards and the tweet.
I mean, I have a simple point, but hopefully an important one, which is that our immigration policy needs to be humane. And I think fundamentally what it is right now is not that. And part of what has driven unauthorized immigration in the recent years is the fact that it takes 12 to 15 years for people to get through the regular process, if they're lucky, to reunite with their family members. A recent study by the Suarez Orozcos, who used to be at Harvard, they're now, Marcelo's gonna be the new dean of the School of Ed at UCLA, they found that children on average in their study, there's a longitudinal study of immigrant children of all ethnicities and ages, on average they had been separated from parents for at least 5 years during the immigration process. And it just to think about, and that's the legal system, right? And think about, and among unauthorized immigrants, how many people have family members deported during their lives, brothers, parents, whatnot, and the disruptions that entails, and the fact that many of them have primary caretakers or grandparents who then are not considered close family members and therefore not eligible to come and join the family when they do migrate. And so fundamentally, I think our system right now is just deeply inhumane in terms of thinking of people as humans with lives and connections and people that they love who want to be with them. And so I think if we have that be the point of departure, we can probably fix a lot of the problems that we have.
So what Lisa did was appeal to the better angels among us. And I think part of the challenge, especially in politics, is you need to appeal to the demons as well. You need to think of how incentives are structured and how people respond to incentives. And I think the analogy of the political football is an interesting one. Romney actually brought that up yesterday to say that Democrats are not serious about immigration reform. And I think that is a kind of critique that you have among progressives in the Democratic Party too, and not just on immigration, say on the environment and other issues, where you get mileage out of contributions and votes by almost making it past the goal line, but not quite there. So I don't even know if football's the right analogy. I'm thinking it's almost like a sumo wrestling match in which you don't want to get pushed outside of the boundary, right? The game is still on as long as you're keeping it's live within. And it seems to me that that's where immigration is. You would think, there was an opportunity, and this was one of Karl Rove's dreams, was to have a Republican president with a Republican Congress pass some kind of comprehensive immigration reform, to have a generation of people associate that with the Republican Party. What they'd been known for prior to that was in California with Proposition 187, and the Republican Party is really hurting in California from that experience. Arizona is going through that now, and many people argue that in the next 10 to 20 years, Arizona is going to flip and probably never go back because of, it's almost this kind of hump in which you have enough diversity in which people are threatening, but they don't have political power. But if we're waiting for demographic change, to reform our immigration policies, that's going to wait a really long time. And this is also one of the things. I mean, part of in studying this is these are real lives at stake, and there's all sorts of tragedies here. But it is also fascinating because I think it offers us some perspectives in terms of how politics works. And one of the things to me is to show how federalism works, right? So here so Republicans need to do something at the national level. They cannot win the presidency. Right now, it's estimated at 38%. Next time, among Latinos, it'll probably be above 40%. They need to win above 40% of Latino votes to be viable. But you have many states in this country where this is not a problem. You could go immigrant bash and do just fine. And you have this fundamental tension between what the imperatives of the national party are and what the imperatives of local and state parties are. You also have a tension between short-term electoral gain and long-term electoral prospects. I think the hope among many Republicans is that you get people like Marco Rubio, you get people like Bobby Jindal, and others and Nikki Haley, who will represent the future of the party, so people will forget all of this craziness. The problem is immigrants, a lot of them are forming their opinions about the parties as we speak. And we know that with political socialization that these effects last decades. So it is a challenge. So I think what I would do is to it would be the kind of Jeb Bush argument, right? Which is that it is a suicide pact to go down this path. But there are enough people with regional and state powers who could hold the national party hostage, and that continues to be the case.
Oh, do you want to jump in? Oh, go ahead.
Can you all hear me? So I don't have to. Okay. All right. So I just want to add really briefly to that I think that immigration is really it's a litmus test kind of issue. It's not even amongst Latinos. It's not the most important issue. When you do surveys, it's not the most important issue. It's not even the first, second, or third issue, right? It's education, the economy, jobs, healthcare, social issues, abortion. These things come before immigration, but it's the tone of the candidate and of the party on that issue that really reflects, what do you think about people like me? What do you think about us? And I think that for the self-interest, right, beyond the kind of goodwill politics appeal, that when you appeal to the self-interest of a party or a candidate, they need to understand that it's your tone that matters. Ask Scott Brown, who will distance himself. Ask these others candidates who will need to distance themselves from some of candidate Romney's comments, because they understand that it is not, that what is important is that you say, this is not how I see the world, right? I might not be able to fix immigration today, right? So maybe that's the football or the sumo wrestling, but that tone matters. It counts. It's the way that people interpret their political world. And so if they continue down that path of kind of playing to a very conservative base, then I think it will be costly in the long run for that very reason, right?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Just on a local note, you have to remember that Senator Lugar lost his seat in great part because of support of the DREAM Act. So we have to really look at what's happened here in Indiana on this topic. There's no better way to get on the front page of the newspaper than introducing anti-immigrant legislation. The senator who keeps introducing it every other year represents Carmel, one of the most diverse communities in our state. 10% Chinese, 10% Indian. Yet those communities do not speak out against his positions on immigration. How will we know who's here legally and not legally? Why do those communities not say, are you going to be checking my papers every morning on my way to work, Eli Lilly or Dow? I think this, locally, we're feeling this. It is a credential to being a conservative. It works, and they've been very successful at stifling the voices of those who would be most impacted by the legislation. If I had two minutes with the president, I'd say look at Canada and how Canada is using immigration for economic reasons attracting talent, building their country, they're gonna cream us here if, we don't get with the program. Economics speak loudly, and talent and bright people. Look at all the international students who are here. You're gonna leave and go work in Canada because you're gonna get a visa that you won't get here. How stupid is that for us? So that's my comment on the Indiana side of things.
Anybody else, or could we jump to?
Well, I mean, I think just speaking to all this is we can't waffle anymore, right? We can't say with the H-2A program, you can come here and we'll exploit your labor, and then you can't get here through means that are, to use Lisa's term, more humane, right? We allow this sort of dual system of tracking people in, but not in a way that is supposed to be permanent or more than sort of useful for us, and I don't think that's a very good message.
Well, I just hope we get these invitations from the White House in January.
I'm sure it'll.
What I'm going to do is blend two comments together. One old-style index card combined with from Marcela Alvarado comment. So one audience member remarks on how President Obama has deported more immigrants than George W. Bush. Okay, true fact. Okay.
You said why?
No, the person asks why is that, but then Marcela asks, with President Obama's deferred action legislation, there is some fear to submit applications, not knowing the outcome of the election. And so, okay, we just got done hearing about how if immigrants have a political home, it's probably going to be the Democratic Party, but we have a little bit of tension here. So what I'm going to ask our panelists to comment on, and let's make this very specific, if you had a friend who was undocumented and could apply, fit the right profile to apply for this deferred action, what would you tell your friend?
Well, I do want to answer the why question. The reason Obama has deported more people than George W. Bush is because of secure communities and 287G, which is a policy that was started under Bush and accelerated under Obama, which is the cooperation between local police and immigration authorities. That means if you get pulled over for a broken taillight and you get brought to their attention, you get caught up in the system and there's no way out. And so that is a big part. That's a big chunk of why it sort of grew up and accelerated. In terms of what I've actually had this conversation, I have the privilege of working with many of the AB 540 students on our campus who are asking this question. And I have to say my answer has been I can't answer it for them. On the one hand, the questioner is absolutely right. You're bringing yourself to the attention of federal authorities. On the other hand, I think about, so one of these students helps me out at my center, and last summer he was moving his stuff from one room to another, and he borrowed a friend's truck, and the truck broke down, and a Berkeley police officer came to help, right, to see if he could help him. And he walked into the office, and he was white. I mean, just absolutely white from having, the cop was trying to help him, right, but that interaction. And I have to say, I can't imagine what it must feel like for him every day to live with that. And his brother was also deported a month after that experience. And so living for 2 years without that threat over your head for the first time in your life, I don't know, right? I mean, who am I to say what that's worth? But I think you have to think about what the value of not having that constant stress is for these students, and the hope that it gives them for something better.
Can I jump in here? And I'll plug in some of my grad students and the work that they're doing. One of them is it was coming up with the perspectives that looks at this. There's this notion of electoral capture among African Americans within the Democratic Party. And this one is looking at that for Latinos. So electoral capture is this theory that Paul Freimer came up with. And no one's really looked at it in terms of updated it since Bill Clinton, but there's a lot of rumbling among advocates of African Americans and liberals more generally that just because you have a Democrat in the White House does not mean that you have interests represented, and even having an African American Democrat in the White House does not mean that you have poor people's interests or African American interests represented in a meaningful way. And there is a real danger there. I mean, this is part of the political football kind of an argument in which you get enough mileage to go a certain distance but not clinch it. And so in terms of why is this happening, part of it is that you have things that were started to put into place, but part of it is you have
chose to continue.
Yeah, you have a president who has to show that they're enforcing the law to some extent, but you also have, I mean, it's so cynical, but you have two different types of audiences, right? So you have, I mean, what President Obama did was they ramped up enforcement efforts in the first half of the fiscal year to be able to get that 400,000 goal, and that is a goal of Homeland Security. It never goes above 400,000, you'll notice. But it always flirts near there. It's weird, right? So it goes up, so they did this massive set of deportations in the first half of the fiscal year, and then when it comes time for people to start paying attention to politics, lo and behold, there's this new policy of deferred action, because all of the people who you think are not going to show up to the polls, you need to throw them a bone as well. So you can have it both ways. I don't think it's a bad headline for them, because they can say, we are enforcing immigration laws. Look at the number of deportations we've had to one type of audience. And then they can turn around with, sometimes it's the same person who can make the argument to different audiences, but usually it's different spokespeople that go out and explain the policy to the communities. It's really what? It's the old trope of worthy and unworthy. Right.
Too on that, to answer that question, I was actually struck. So I had a student who graduated, a very good student. She's taken several of my courses, and she emailed me this summer to say, I don't know what to do. I've graduated. I can't get a job. I don't know how to go forward. What about the DREAM Act? And I didn't know what to say, because I didn't understand the contours of her experience, that she had lived in fear the entire time that she was my student and still trying to perform and do the things that she needed to do. And she's in Chicago, where they had this big, massive kind of gathering at the pier to kind of celebrate the opening of the applications. And I think just today or yesterday, some of the people are getting their very first notification that they have been, the action has been deferred, and so now they have a card that they can go out and apply for jobs. And so, in answer to the question about what I would tell a friend, I don't know. I told her I was hopeful for her, right? That and she was hopeful about maybe getting it. She got a lawyer. I mean, she did. Because of the very fact that even if it's that 2-year window, that maybe I can breathe freely, and that maybe I can do something else. I will say that I think that the Democratic Party has played both ends, but I'm not quite as cynical perhaps as what Karthik has presented. In that, I think that the president very much supported passage of the DREAM Act, I think, early on, and that it came just a hair's breadth of winning passage. It was filibustered in the 2010 Congress. It was a Democratic Congress, but it was slowed down by threats from Republican senators to say that they will hold up all the other work in the Senate if they move forward with that bill, and so it was tabled at that point. So had that happened, we'd be looking at a very different kind of world, I think, and I think that was what the president was hoping for in 2010, and it simply didn't happen. So.
Well, and maybe I'll play devil advocate here and say I would wait, because it's not clear what happens to that information should another administration come in and decide they don't want to do this. And are these people going to be given a pass, like we won't come after you because this was the policy and you had a chance to lawfully apply for this status, but once this goes away, what happens to your information? It's already out there, and you can't take it back at that point.
One thing I do want to say in relation to this, so there is this phenomenon that's been pretty long understood, in which you have not just youth, but a lot of undocumented immigrants file their taxes because they've been always been told that if there's a legalization, you have to pay your back taxes. So a lot of people actually do follow the rules.
And it's a way of showing that you were here.
Right.
Proving that you were
You're
here.
proving that you're here, you have those records. But I think in many ways, I find it so impressive that people take these kind of risks all the time, right? And to me, it's also just impressive that, like that kind of police, that kind of interaction in which you have people who are able to, I mean, yes, they live in fear, but they're also surviving and sometimes even thriving. And I think that's a hopeful story as well.
Well, let's move on to another topic. And I'm going to pull two items together. Tom Chu out there asks, how does U.S. immigration policy compare to that of other industrialized nations? And somebody called Lil Bit asks, okay, and
Jay is just awesome.
You're outing all these people.
Okay, I'm not making it up. Okay, what do you think about the point system? Okay, so they're sort of getting at the same kind of thing. Yeah. Anybody want to comment? What do you think of the point system, and how does U.S. policy compare to other countries where you do have point systems? Yeah.
As someone who is married to a Canadian and spent some time in Canada, I'm gonna, and I know there are some Canadians in the room here too, so I'm gonna be a little careful with what I say. But Canada's touted as a place that is so progressive, but Canada has pretty tight immigration controls. And part of it is because it's difficult to avoid the state in Canada. I mean, you have a pretty generous welfare state, but it's difficult to avoid it. So Canada has a very rational immigration system, but that does include temporary workers. They've had issues with asylees, and they've tried to clamp down on people who overstay as their claims are being adjudicated. But one thing that someone told me that it has stuck with me, and this came up with the debate on multiculturalism and the kind of rethinking of multiculturalism in Europe. And someone who studies Canadian immigration and immigrant integration said that Canada was able to do multiculturalism on immigration. Now, multiculturalism in Canada comes out of the Quebec experience, but Canada's been able to do it because there is no one national origin group that was allowed to dominate. So it's not just a point system, but it's explicitly designed in a way that you don't have the Mexican problem or the Turkish problem or the Muslim problem, right? So Canada in some ways has managed it quite well, but I don't know if Canada had the kinds of political dynamics or even demographic dynamics that the United States did, whether it would have an outcome that is that different. But that is something that so I think in terms of other industrialized countries, Canada is often pointed to as an example, not just in terms of the point system, but even the integration, immigrant integration aspect that Lisa had mentioned. There are massive investments, not just in citizenship, but other forms of getting people civically integrated.
Other thoughts on the point system?
No, just I'm heading to France tomorrow. My mother is French, and I have to say that after a week there, I'm usually horrified by what I see on television around immigration. It makes our debate here seem incredibly civil. When these issues come up, we have a lot of visitors from the State Department who come to Indianapolis to observe our election system, learn about the diversity within our communities. Europe is really struggling with this issue. And so it's always nice to compare. Someone's worse off than us.
And any other thoughts on the point system?
I mean, the point system is just, to me, problematic, right? Because you get preferences for your skill sets and that kind of thing. And it's like, shouldn't people who don't necessarily have the most skill have the right to try to migrate? And not to say that they don't, but I'm still not fully formed on how I feel about the point system in general. I mean, we don't have sort of these unlimited numbers of visas to give out. We set a cap. We have a cap. I can't remember what it is right now off the top of my head.
It's been there for a long time.
It's been there for a long time, and
20,000 per country.
And so when you have that, and then you give people preferences for being married and trying to reconcile families or having high skills, I mean, something about that leaves me a little cold. So that's my personal feeling about it. But in terms of what it means bureaucratically, it clearly doesn't help us become more efficient at issuing visas. So I'm not sure what the purpose is.
Good. Well, let me blend two more questions
You're
together.
a good blender.
Well, I'm inclusive. Okay. We got one from Ceres Garamella, who asks, do second-generation immigrants support new immigrants? And that's overlapping somewhat with how can immigrants organize to change immigration policy? So two sort of questions about immigrant mobilization. to affect change, kind of putting the limelight back on immigrants as a force in American politics. How can immigrants organize to change immigration policy?
Well, in answer to the first, I think I can do the Latino side if you're willing to do the Asian. I know for Latinos, if you look at public opinion polling, at least before the early 1990s, native-born Latinos actually weren't that much more supportive of immigration than other Americans. What has happened is that the rhetoric has gotten to a level, right? So what happens in and then what happens in 1994, at least in California, Proposition 187, where early on, native-born Latinos are actually supportive of the measure, and then Pete Wilson put advertisements on the television which clearly showed Mexicans crossing the border. So that it wasn't just a neutral, we didn't have Chinese people coming in on boats, we didn't talk about all the illegal Irish, right? We were talking about Mexicans crossing the border, and so the racialization of the issue has actually made it a much more cross-generational issue than I think it would be naturally. So that now it's understood that even if you are actually quite distant from the immigrant generation, you understand that this rhetoric actually does affect you. It affects how your kids are treated, it affects, all of those things. And so, that's not a natural phenomenon, but it is the product of our current politics. And so when you have the marches, at least, I can speak in California, the ones I participated in LA, you had people of all generations, because people understand it's a Mexican issue, right? In California, it's become, and so, and even if you're Salvadoran, people understand, people think you're Mexican, so it counts for you too. So it's something about, the framing that has made it, again, it's not that all Latinos care about immigration, but even third generation Latinos understand that how that debate gets framed is about all of us, because it's been racialized in a particular way.
So on Asian Americans, I think that on the intergenerational dynamic, you certainly have second generation immigrants who care about what happens to their parents' generation, and they care about education, similar to Latinos as well. But one of the interesting things is, I think the limit of cross-racial alliances on immigration. So one of the things there's some benefit when you have this kind of racialization in terms of the political response. You get Latinos mobilized in a major way. But one of the things you would have noted in 2006 in most of the cities, Chicago being a major exception, most of the marchers were Latino. In LA, you had a contingent of Korean immigrants who also marched. Chicago, you had Polish, you had all sorts of immigrants marching in Chicago. Chicago has a very strong, but the crowds in New York were tiny compared to Chicago. They were diverse. And they were diverse. They were diverse, but they were much smaller. But Chicago offers you see what happens with the teachers' strike in Chicago. Chicago offers some interesting kind of angles on what cross-racial alliances might be like, pro-immigrant marches might be like, pro-union, pro-worker activism is like. And I think that takes me to the second question, which, I'll just play this role of being a cynic today. I'm just going to try that on. This is something I've said before. Which is the 2006 marches. In some ways, you can see is a kind of natural response, especially with Jim Sensenbrenner's bill. But I'm also a little cynical there. So there, you had basically all of the power brokers who were trying to affect change from the outside. They didn't have privileged access to power. Now, my question is, why don't you see massive street protests in 2009 and 2010, 2011, 2012, with this rise in deportations? Well, you have a Democrat in the White House. You have Democrats in Congress for parts of that time. You have labor at the table, supposedly. You have immigrant advocates at the table, supposedly. And this goes back to a kind of captured group in which it doesn't make sense to take to the streets, supposedly. Now, at the same time, you have other groups within the Democratic Party that selectively either show or withdraw their support based on their commitment to issues. We've seen different examples of that. Part of it in terms of President Obama's announcement on gay marriage. That was a big deal, and it wasn't just because of Sasha and Malia's friends, right? Let's be real about that. So there are ways in which other groups have been more savvy in terms of how they either in which they try to hold their party representatives or elected representatives accountable. And on immigration, it's happening a little bit. You can see deferred action as an example of that. But I think more can happen.
I guess I do want to
disagree with Karthik, though, on sort of the empirical point, because my colleague Irene Blumrad has been in the field following up on people who participated in the 2006 marches, and the deportations are why they're not marching in 2009 and 2010, because people are scared. And many people think that that the deportations, if you want to be cynical, were a reaction to people going into the streets, a negative reaction, and that the fact that people are terrified in these communities, and you have res all over the place in different places in California, means people just don't feel comfortable doing it. And I don't think the organizations were in charge in 2006. They were doing raids a year ago in Pomona. I walked by one. They're doing raids all the time in communities. And even if they don't have to do that many for people to be afraid.
Well, if I
And
can,
at least
yeah.
at least the people they're talking to are afraid.
I want to
really
let
afraid.
Valeria jump in.
But I'm sorry.
Oh, Valeria, and then
No,
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I think this actually points to what I think is a fundamental strategic issue about the politics of goodwill or the politics of self-interest, right? Because I think that when we present these ideas as kind of about immigration let me back up. When Karthik, when you talk about kind of why would a president respond to the LGBT community and not to this other very important community who can offer its votes, I think a big part of it is resources. Who's bringing money to the table, right? And so when we rely on the politics of goodwill and you don't have money to bring to the table and you have votes and I can capture your votes through some other way of doing it, and I don't need to heavily signal that. I can wait to the very last minute to do that because I'm not relying on your money necessarily. Then I think that is where we need to really shift in terms of the politics of self-interest. How do you get into what the political candidate, into what the candidate's self-interest is? How do you access it? One way, I mean, maybe is I don't have an answer there, but part of it must be related to some political action committees. You know, what I like to tell folks about blacks in the Obama campaign in 2008 is it was a layaway campaign. It was $5 a month for a full year, right? Or, you know, but you get a lot of $5 and that's somebody you pay attention to occasionally. I mean, and so I think that maybe we have to reconfigure a strategy that does not request kind of kindness, but really taps into goodwill. The other thing that I would like a bit of a response to is early in the year, so this kind of intergenerational kind of question about the issue of immigration. Early in the year, there were some articles in, I want to say the Huffington Post or someplace, around "I Ain't No Anchor Baby." I don't know if you remember. Okay, so but at any rate, so if we remember early in the year, this idea of anchor babies, the idea that undocumented immigrants were here having children so they could be anchored to the United States. It's pejorative and offensive, but there were certainly people who responded to say, that's not me. I am a good immigrant. I am a deserving immigrant. I am not like that. And so I think that it can also work as a kind of wedge political issue to kind of activate that in a way that undoes potential coalitions. And I do think that there was a way that people came together, but that those kinds of issues, you know, are you a good one or are you a good one or not so good one? And the good ones can stay, right? And maybe keeping a low profile helps with that, but. Yeah.
I see that in our local communities where there's immense pride in being here legally, and I don't fully understand it, but one Sikh gentleman, I remember at one of these forums around immigration, stood up and said, you know, and pulled out his passport, and he said, "I'm a U.S. citizen, and here's my passport, and I'm here legally." And it broke my heart because I thought the only countries where I carry my passport are totalitarian countries. I carry my passport when I'm in Argentina and the junta's in charge. I carry my passport when I'm in former East European countries, et cetera. Those are, for me, the notion of carrying a passport is of being in a totalitarian state where I carry my passport to protect myself. And there's a different perception here about what that means. I don't want him to have to carry his passport in his own country.
I just want to, real quick, because I think that worthy unworthy is a really important distinction, and one of the really interesting political work going on within the DREAM movement right now is how do they talk about their parents, And how do we create a narrative? Because by definition, if you say I'm here through no fault of my own, you're saying the fault was my parents, and my parents are the lawbreakers. And many of these students are well aware of this, and in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion about, and the 67% of undocumented youth that don't qualify for the DREAM Act is the other part that we don't talk about. And so I think if people are interested in immigration for research, I think there's some really interesting question. Can you build a narrative of inclusion that doesn't create this distinction for folks who don't have citizenship rights, right? Which is a very different kind of civil rights movement than we've ever had in the United States.
Let me jump in. We have a lot of students here, and I imagine this was written by a student, and it's a very plain-spoken question. Why should students care about immigration?
I love it.
Okay. Why? So maybe
Because it's
maybe
on the final.
or maybe there's some extra credit. Why should these students care about immigration?
I mean, I know for me at least, I care about it because I think I care deeply about the kind of country we want to be. And I think we can always revise who we are, right, to use Huntington's bad language. And I think, you know, immigrants are a fact of our life and have been for a long time. We've not dealt with that in a very coherent or sane way ever. And I think it's a good time to start trying to do that. And I do think part of the reason we've been brought to this conversation that we're having right now is coming to some real hard facts, right? That we are not as white as we think we are, and we won't be anymore. And how do we deal with that? Particularly a country that has not been very good about including. We like to treat justice as if it's something that's always there, and it's just been momentary slippages in the application of these principles that we supposedly live by, instead of treating them as real problems that are deeply embedded from the founding. I don't know how you get a just nation with slavery and Native American removal. I don't. So I think it's a chance for us to revise and revisit, right? I mean, I really like Bonnie Honig's work on the foreigner founder and the work that does about kind of thinking about who we want to be and trying to sort of reaffirm some of these principles in a new way. I mean, there's nothing that says we have to be what we've always been, which is xenophobic and claustrophobic. And I would also like to point out, too, that, you know, we've been talking about this in terms of Asians and Latinos, but let's not forget that there are African and West Indian folks who are also immigrants as well that we often don't see because we just think of them as black. And that presents some interesting questions as well in terms of the cross-racial dynamics. So I just wanted to throw that in there. But that's why it matters, I think, to students and to me.
I'll make one plug for another book. There's a book by Dow Myers called Boomers and Immigrants. And, I mean, that gets to one of the things that we're doing right, although in a very messy way in the United States compared to Europe, is solving the dependency ratio problem. So in Europe, because of low fertility rates and historically low rates of immigration, you're not only having population decline, you're having more people that are out of the workforce and fewer people in the workforce that are trying to sustain that social welfare state. And the US, because it's had a much longer tradition of immigration and higher birth rates among both the native-born and immigrants themselves, has been able to avoid that problem for the most part. At least it's postponed the day of reckoning much longer down the road than Japan and many Western European countries. So that is something that, I mean, if you want Social Security, if you want Medicare, you want immigration, and it's not just the high skilled immigrants, right? I mean, so if you're talking about future workforce, you know, we all want to be people in the 53%. We all want to be in the 53% and not the 47%, but. You know, but we need all sorts of workers. So that's one of the issues is, of course, we need STEM workers, but we also need people working in farms. We also need people working in all sorts of jobs. And I think it's important to not to forget that, to not just think of, in terms of a point system, that the only people that we really need to bring in are the college graduates and the high-tech workers. We need people all across the scale.
Just to piggyback up and to think about who immigrants are. Most people stay home, right? Most people don't leave. The people who are motivated enough and focused enough to leave and build something better in a different place are the people that are going to keep this country going, right? They're special. And not little bus special, special.
Let me blend two more comments together, and we started talking about this, but this actually, really crystallizes it. How Sunmin Kim asks, how do you persuade Native voters, U.S.-born voters, who feel at a loss with unemployment, through immigration? And somebody else, without a name here on the index card, asks, you talked about the human side of immigration. What about the economic, read jobs side of immigration, and the idea that there might be some kind of cost that people feel? So what do you tell to such a voter who feels afraid that they're going to lose their job because of immigration?
I would say that the data conclusively shows that immigrants are not displacing Americans from their jobs typically, right? And so that the typically the kinds of jobs that not universally, so I will say undocumented immigrants here, that they are not typically competing for the same jobs that native-born Americans are working in. And when I will speak specifically about my own research. We used an immigration variable to look at African-American political participation to see if there was some connection between immigration and a decline in black civic participation. And we found that there was a relationship, but it wasn't about kind of displacement in terms of jobs. Maybe it was some perception or something else, but there's no economic evidence that for at least an African-American population that they are being displaced from lower level jobs by a growing population of people that are competing with them. There doesn't seem to be that kind of evidence. And I would say to kind of turn it around a little bit, to tie it back to the previous question, that again, if we look at a self-interested argument about why any 19, 20, 22, 23, or 24-year-old might be interested in immigration, I think you have to consider that you're part of a global world. You are a global citizen, and your entire world is changing. So 20 years from now, 50 years from now, what is your world going to look like? What is the world that you're inheriting? How will America be seen in it? And I think that matters in terms of how welcoming we are to immigrant populations and how well we absorb them.
And just to piggyback, I haven't found any work that suggests that immigrants, in particular undocumented immigrants, are taking work from native citizens. What's been found is that in rural communities or smaller communities is that these folks take jobs that were typically seasonal or people rotated in and out of in times of unemployment or underemployment, like cucumber picking or crab plucking, and have become permanent in those jobs. But that's a little bit different than saying people are taking jobs. And in other work like Thomas Skovic and Devi, if I'm remembering correctly, found that what immigrants were working in slow growth or no growth industries, that these were jobs that poor whites and blacks had already either left or rotated into some higher echelon, so they were not competing for the same type of employment even within the same industry. And even for my research, I found that people were concerned about it because I think it's talked about so much, and it's a very popular frame that we always sort of go to. They're going to take jobs and Americans won't have jobs. They're the fault why Americans can't get jobs. But when I asked people, did they fear that their own job was in danger? And they were like, no, because I'm highly skilled, right? I work on a computer all day, or I have a degree. So it's a fear that people have. I don't know if it's all that rational, and at least from the research I found, it's not been borne out that people are taking these jobs.
I'll just say something very quickly on this. So one caveat is that none of us are labor economists, right? So this is not our original research. So no, I mean, I think that's because, but among labor economists, there's like one kind of caveat to that, and they say among high school dropouts, there might be some wage pressures there. But generally speaking, immigrants also create jobs. So you have famous cases like Riverside, New Jersey, that passed a very restrictive ordinance, and their entire downtown businesses shut down because those are all immigrant-run businesses. And they had to go back and change the law because it was bad for the economy. And there are many places in this country, especially in parts of the Midwest, that would lose tons of people if they did not have immigration. They keep communities alive in ways that they wouldn't. The one thing I was going to say from a political scientist perspective, what I find fascinating is there's this sense that, oh, economic anxiety is what is fueling all this concern about immigration. But just the timing of it is very suspect, right? So when you see the biggest rise in state and local legislation, when it really took off, was in 2006. The peak, probably the biggest, kind of the tightest labor market. The economy was roaring. And then you had people proposing and passing these kinds of laws. It made sense from a kind of a political logic, right? Especially with the Bush administration, what it was trying to do, and the kind of insurrection within the Republican Party. It didn't make sense from an economic perspective, right? But then you go post-economic crash, you thought that nativism would spike after the financial collapse. But thank God for Wall Street, because there was a very clear scapegoat there, right? It was very clear. So you couldn't make the argument that immigrants brought our economy down. It was like, it had to be a very convoluted argument to do that. And that's why I was also so glad to see Occupy Wall Street come back too, because it's like, yes, let's just remember what caused the problem in the first place. So there has been less scapegoating of immigrants this time around than in 1990, 1991, which is what helped lay the foundation for Prop 187 in California.
The feedback I get from the CEOs of our major employers is that if they could hire every PhD that comes out of this university and the other universities in the state, and it's not enough. Their fear is if they cannot get the talent to the jobs here, the jobs will go where the talent is. So it is an important economic issue for our large employers here. I have never heard that, that people with advanced degrees were not coveted. One of my board members is from Germany. He is desperate for a mathematician. He can't find one. And so this is the perspective that I hear from our state employers and also the elected officials, that not the ones who are in the immigration thing. But don't be fooled. I expected this argument when I went to the legislature about jobs. It's much uglier than that. It's about security, and everyone who is not here legally is a potential terrorist. Even though the terrorists from 9/11 were here legally with visas, that doesn't, truth doesn't get in the way of their stories. It is a very frightening situation when you hear this. It should frighten all of us who live and vote in Indiana, because it's not the jobs argument. It's the homeland security, everybody that doesn't look like they're supposed to is a potential threat to our security. It's really ugly.